The cold morning light always arose slowly in those, like a secret the sun was hesitant to share. Every day began with silence, broken only by the brittle sound of frost giving way under the weight of dawn. It was here, far beyond the edges of maps, human impatience, that the man everyone once called crazy had found a kind of peace no one could understand. His name didn't matter much anymore, at least not to him. In the small valley below, the hunters used to whisper about him, some with amusement, others with pity. They said he had lost his mind after living too long with nothing but the wind and the wolves for company. But to those who looked closer, if anyone ever dared climb high enough to find him, he was a man who had simply learned what it truly meant to live. He woke before the sun every morning, not because he had to, but because something inside him felt the rhythm of the mountain, an ancient pulse that called him to move with it. The world below still slept while he wrapped himself in layers of old fur and canvas, stepped outside his cabin, stood still for a moment, breathing in the icy. The valley lay beneath him like a sleeping giant, covered blanket of. The trees stood stiff, their branches jeweled with frost, and a faint mist hovered over the frozen lake at the edge of the ridge. That lake was his church, his mirror, his table, and his test, the place where he had learned what patience truly meant, and where he would later teach everyone who mocked him what wisdom looks like when it's carved from ice. The hunters used to laugh when they saw him carrying his old spear and bucket toward the frozen water. They said fishing through ice in that place was madness. The water was too deep, the fish too scarce, and the cold too fierce. Some joked that he only did it to have an excuse to talk to the lake. "That old man's lost his senses," they'd say, spitting into the snow. "Thinks he can pull dinner out of frozen stone." But the man never argued, never raised his voice, never cared for their words. He knew that the mountain doesn't give its secrets to those who shout, only to those who listen. He reached the edge of the lake, its surface glimmering under the rising light. The ice was thick enough to walk on, smooth and glass-like in some places, rough and cracked in others. He knew every inch of my heart. Every sound, every vibration beneath his boots told him story of the water, how it moved, where it breathed, where life still swam unseen. He knelt, placing his hand on the for a moment closed. It wasn't prayer, at least not in the way the world defines it. It was something older, quieter, a communion between man and nature, one that required no words. Then, with careful precision, he chipped a hole into the ice, slow and steady, never breaking rhythm, never forcing the blade. The hunters who once watched from afar couldn't understand why he took so long, why he seemed to waste hours over something that could be done in minutes. They didn't see that what he was doing wasn't just fishing, it was listening. Once the hole was ready, he sat beside it, unmoving. The cold bit into his fingers, his breath rose in faint clouds, and his eyes never left the circle of dark. There were no rods, no fancy lures, no bait the way the hunters used. Instead, he had something they didn't, a trick so strange, so old, and so simple that most people would laugh if they saw it. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small pouch of herbs and berries crushed into a fine dust. The scent was faint but earthy, like pine needles. He sprinkled a pinch of it into the hole, whispering something under his breath that only the mountain, the hunters who had seen him do it before, had laughed themselves sick. "He's feeding the fish spices now," one had said. "Maybe he's trying to season them before they bite." But the man just smiled, quiet, knowing. The lake didn't mind the laughter. It never did. Minutes passed, then hours. The light grew stronger, cutting through the mist, revealing the untouched beauty of the frozen wilderness. Most people have gone home by now, their patience spent, their bodies shivering. But he stayed, still as stone, eyes locked on the waters. Then, slowly, a ripple formed beneath the ice, faint but unmistakable. The man's fingers twitched slightly as he lifted his spear. The ripple grew stronger, and the dark shape of something large moved below. With a single, fluid motion he struck, driving the spear through the ice into the depths. The sound echoed like a crack of thunder across the valley. When he pulled it back up, a massive fish, thick, shining silver blue, even in the struggled at the end of it. Dinner, clean, cold, perfect. No rod, no bait, no luck, patient and understanding. That was the day the laughter stopped. The hunters who had followed him there, some out of mockery, some out of curiosity, stood in stunned silence. They had never seen a fish that's caught, not in winter, not by anyone. The man looked at them without pride, without smugness, as if the whole thing had meant nothing more than breathing. He simply nodded, pulled the fish from the spear, and set it aside in the snow. The mountain had given him what he needed, and that was enough. That night, as he cooked the fish over a small fire beside his cabin, the hunters gathered below in their camp. None of them laughed. They spoke in low voices, wondering he'd done it, whether it was magic, luck, or madness that guided. Some wanted to ask, but none dared. The old man ate quietly, watching the smoke rise into the starless sky. To him, it wasn't a trick. It was balance, the invisible understanding between a man and the land that feeds him. He had learned that if you listen long enough, even the frozen waters speak. People often imagine that solitude makes a man forget the world, but it isn't true. It makes him remember it differently. The hunters saw a fool who wasted hours staring into, but he saw something else, the movement of life beneath stillness, the pulse of something eternal hiding in what others call emptiness. The mountain had taught him everything alive, no matter how silent or small, has its own rhythm. To find food, peace, or even meaning here, one must first match that rhythm. That's what they never understood. Fishing, to him, wasn't about catching something to eat. It was about understanding the hidden language of the cold. The next day, when he walked down to the lake again, one of the younger hunters followed him. The boy had a curious look, the kind that only comes from those who still believe there are things worth learning. He didn't speak, just watched. The man noticed him, but said nothing. When they reached the lake, he repeated the same slow ritual, the kneeling, the hand on the ice, the careful chipping. The boy grew restless after a while, shifting his weight, breathing into his hands to stay warm. Hours later, when the fish finally came and the man pulled it from the hole with the same grace as before, the boy's eyes widened in disbelief. "How did you know it was there?" he finally asked, voice trembling from cold and awe. The man smiled, a faint glint in his weathered eye. "The lake told me," he said softly. "You just have to learn how to listen." That night, word spread fast. The man who had been mocked for years was now the subject of quiet reverence. The hunters no longer joked when they saw him heading toward the lake. Some began to follow his example, sitting longer, talking less, trying to hear what he heard. Few succeeded, but some learned enough to catch what they needed without waste or pride. The mountain was pleased. It rewards not the clever, but the humble. Every time he looked out over that frozen expanse, he felt the same gratitude, the same quiet joy. He didn't need applause or understanding. He had the mountain, the lake, and the silence, everything that a man could ever need to know himself. People below still told stories about him, adding their own versions, calling him a hermit, a mystic, a fool, or a legend. But the truth was simpler. He was just a man who learned that if you give yourself fully to the place you live in, the land becomes part of, and you of it. That's when the miracles begin to look ordinary. As the wind carried his breath away in soft clouds of silver, he often wondered how many people in the world would ever feel what he felt that morning, standing over the ice, holding his breath as the water below whispered secrets older than memory. Probably not many. Most were too busy chasing noise to notice the meaning inside the quiet. But that didn't sadden him. It only made him more grateful that life had led him here, to a mountain where laughter once mocked him, and where silence in the end crowned him. as its only disciple. And before we go deeper into his past and the reason he chose to live here, tell me, where are you watching this story from today? Before he ever came to the mountains, before frost and silence became his only companion, the man had known a very different kind of noise. It was the noise of cities rushing nowhere, of conversations that meant nothing, promises that dissolved like smoke. He had lived in a world where value was measured by speed, where no one stopped long enough to feel the wind or notice the sun slipping across the sky. In that life, he had worked hard, too hard perhaps, chasing the same invisible thing everyone else chased: money, security, recognition, something he could never quite name. He had friends, or at least the kind of people who stay close with laughter and light. But underneath it all, he felt a growing emptiness, something no success could fill. He wasn't born a hermit. He was born a man of flesh, dreams and fears, and a heart that once beat. He had a family once, a woman who believed in him, and a small son with eyes bright as morning dew. Those were the only two people who ever truly. They lived in a small house on the outskirts of a busy town, surrounded by fields that once felt endless. The man used to wake early even then, not for the beauty of dawn, but to leave for work before the world woke. He spent his days indoors, under artificial lights, building things that didn't last, selling ideas he didn't believe in. He told himself it was for them, for the family, for the future. He told himself it was only temporary. But time, like snow, falls quietly until it buries everything. The turning point came one winter, years ago. It was a season not unlike the ones he would later learn to love, except back then, the cold meant nothing but inconvenience. He remembered the day in fragments, the sound of the phone, the flashing light, the way the world seemed to hold its breath. His wife and son had been driving home through a storm. A truck had lost control on the frozen road. By the time he arrived, the world he knew was gone. Everything that gave meaning to his days had vanished in a single, merciless instant. After that, silence was no longer peaceful. It was punishment. The walls of his house closed in like a tomb, every corner echoing what used to be. The laughter, the footsteps, the soft hum of a bedtime story, all gone. He tried to go on. For months, he did what people do when they lose everything. He kept moving, as if motion itself could fill the emptiness. He went to work. He smiled when people spoke. He said he was fine. But the truth is, grief is not something you heal from. It's something you learn to carry. And the more he tried to bury it, the heavier it grew. One day, he simply stopped pretending. He sold what little he owned, packed a few clothes, some tools, and an old photograph, and walked away. No destination, no plan. Only a need to be where no one could find him, where the noise of the world couldn't reach. He found the mountain by accident, or maybe the mountain found him. He had wandered for days through forests and rivers, sleeping wherever the ground was soft. Then one morning, he woke to find himself standing before a range so tall, so silent, it felt like the edge of the world. The air was sharp and clean, the sky too vast to measure. For the first time in months, he felt something stir in hope, a kind of recognition, as if he had finally reached the one place where pain made sense. The mountain didn't ask questions, didn't offer comfort, didn't try to fix him. It simply stood there, ancient and unmoved, reminding him that life continues even after everything you love is gone. That was enough. He built his first shelter out of fallen logs and stones. It wasn't much, but it kept out the wind. The nights were long, the cold unforgiving, and yet he felt alive in a way he hadn't felt in years. The ache in his chest didn't disappear, began to change. In the city, it had been a wound that refused to close. Here, it became something else, a memory that whispered, screamed. He began to spend his days learning how to live with the land. He learned how to make fire from damp wood, how to trap small game, how to find water beneath snow. He learned how to listen to the wind, how to read the sky, and how to move without disturbing the rhythm of the forest. It wasn't survival, it was surrender. And in that surrender, he found peace. Years passed, though he stopped counting them. Seasons came and went like breaths. The mountain gave him everything he needed, though never without effort. He learned that every gift here had a price. Warmth demanded labor, food demanded patience, and peace demanded solitude. But he paid it gladly. The solitude that had once terrified him became his greatest companion. It spoke to him in ways words never could. Sometimes it came in the cry of an eagle circling above the cliffs. Other times, in the wisp of snow settling the cabin roof. He began to understand that solitude is not the absence of people, but the presence of self. There were days, especially in the early years, when memories came back too vividly. He would see his son's face reflected in the lake or hear his wife's laughter in the wind. At first, he fought those moments, fearing they would break him. But over time, he stopped resisting. He realized that pain only destroys when you try. When you welcome it, it becomes a teacher. So he listened. He let the mountain teach him how to grieve without drowning. He let the cold carve new strength into his bones. He let time do what time does best, soften what cannot be erased. It was during one of those long winters, when food was scarce and the storms unrelenting, that he discovered the strange method of fishing would later make him a legend among hunters. He had no rod, no bait, nothing but an empty stomach, frozen lake. He spent hours studying the ice, watching how the air bubbles moved, where the cracks formed, and how the frost patterns shifted. He began to notice something others never would, that even frozen water had signs that there were places a current but surface wisp of movement, of breath. He experimented, failed, tried again. Eventually, he found that if he poured a mixture of certain herbs into the hole, herbs that carried scents from the forest, the fish below would rise, curious, breaking the stillness of the deep. It wasn't luck, it was connection. The same way he had learned to listen to the wind, he had learned to listen to the water. That discovery wasn't just about survival. It was the moment he realized he no longer wanted to leave. He could have gone back then, back to the towns, back to people, back to warmth and conversation, but the thought didn't appeal to him. He had changed, or perhaps he had simply remembered who he was before the world taught him to forget. The mountain had stripped him of everything unnecessary, leaving only what was true. He no longer needed company to feel alive. He no longer feared silence. The man who once lived in the shadow of loss now lived in the light of solitude. He wasn't escaping life anymore. He was living it fully, finally, completely. People often think those who live alone are running from something. They imagine loneliness as punishment. But the truth is, the loneliest place on earth is the crowd, and where you can be surrounded by faces still unseen. Here, every sound mattered. Every heartbeat was a reminder of existence. He had traded the noise of many for the voice of everything. And when the hunters came, laughing at his ways, he didn't see mockery. He saw reflections of the man he used to be, impatient, restless, lost in the need to prove something. He didn't blame them. He simply waited, knowing that time and hunger teach pride cannot. There were nights when the northern lights stretched across the sky like rivers of color, and he would sit outside, staring at them for hours. Those lights reminded him of his family, distant, beautiful, unreachable, yet always present. He didn't cry anymore when he thought of them. Instead, he felt gratitude for the time they had, for the love they gave, for the pain that had brought him here. He understood now that loss is not the end of it, is its echo traveling through time until it finds to rest, and that silence was his home. Sometimes when travelers passed through and saw smoke rising from his chimney, they would stop by, curious. They asked him if he ever felt lonely, if he ever wished to return. He would smile and say, "I did return. This is where I belong. Most didn't understand, but a few did. The ones who had known real loss, who had tasted the hollow flavor of grief, looked at him different, not as a hermit, but as someone who had walked through fire and found peace on the other side. In the end, he didn't run from the world. He simply stopped chasing. He built a life from silence and snow, and the mountain became his companion, his teacher, his mirror. Every scar on his hands, every wrinkle on his face told the story of a man who had lost everything but found him. And that, he would say if anyone asked, was more than enough. And if you've come this far in his story, take a moment to breathe, to slow down, to feel the quiet around you. And if you want to walk further into this mountain with him, make sure to stay close. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Silence had become his closest companion. Not the fragile kind that cracks at slightest sound, but the deep, breathing silence that lives inside the wind, the tree, even his own. In the beginning, it had frightened him. The nights were too long, too still, and every sound seemed louder than it should be. The creak of wood, the shifting snow, the distant cry of an animal in the dark, they all seemed to whisper his name, testing his resolve. But as the years passed, what once felt like emptiness revealed itself fullness. The silence wasn't an absence. It was a presence. It was the mountain speaking in a language the world had forgotten, and he had learned to listen. Each day began in the same way, though no 2 days were ever truly alike. The sun rose slow and low over the peaks, turning the snow from silver to gold. The man would step outside, his boots sinking softly into the frost, his breath painting brief ghosts in the air. He'd check his traps first, not out of greed, but gratitude. Every animal taken was used completely, every hide tanned, every bone burned or shaped into tools. Waste had no place here. He moved through the woods with quiet precision, his body and the land breathing as one. Sometimes, when he bent to check a snare, a deer would appear just beyond the trees, watching him with unblinking calm. He never moved toward it. They understood each other. Both were creatures of solitude. Neither wished to break. By midday, he'd return to the small structure he had built and rebuilt over the years, each board by hand, each wall in his. Inside, everything had purpose. There was no clutter, no decoration, only what was needed: a table, a bed, a small stove made from an old barrel, and a window that framed the lake like a painting. Sometimes he would sit there for hours, watching the ice shift and the light change. The mountain was alive, breathing in slow seasons instead of seconds. He found comfort in that. The world below chased time, but here time followed him. The silence taught him things no book ever could. He learned that hunger sharpens the senses, that cold cleanses the mind, and that stillness reveals the truth of all. When he spoke, it was rarely out loud. Words, he'd realized, were often too small to hold what he felt. Instead, his thoughts became prayers of action. Every swing of the axe, every breath in the snow, every meal cooked over fire, a conversation with something greater than himself. He didn't need to name it. He could feel it in the rhythm of his work, the same rhythm that guided the river below the ice and the above the. At night, when the firelight flickered against the cabin walls, he would sometimes reach for the old photograph he kept near his bed. The faces had faded. The feeling never did. He didn't cry anymore. Grief had turned into gratitude. They had been the reason he once left the world. Now they were the reason he stayed here. He felt them in the warmth of the fire, in the scent of pine, in the quiet peace that came after storm. Love, he realized, doesn't die. It just changes its voice. Sometimes it speaks through laughter, and sometimes through the whisper of snow falling. The silence became his teacher, and the lessons never. When storms rolled in from the north, fierce and blinding, he didn't fight them. He'd secure the cabin, feed the fire, and wait. He learned that waiting is a form of strength, not weakness. The mountain rewarded patience. It tested every creature that called it home, not out of cruelty, but to reveal what they were made of. During one particularly brutal winter, when food was almost gone and the wind howled for days without rest, he sat by the fire, too weak to move. He thought of leaving, of descending to the valley for help. But then, through the crackling flames, he felt a strange calm. The silence spoke again, not through words, but through presence. It reminded him that he had survived worse, that life never abandons those who refuse to abandon themselves. He closed his eyes, breathed slowly, and waited. The storm passed. It always did. Sometimes days would go by, single sound, the soft shifting of snow. Those were his favorite days. He'd sit by the lake, wrapped in furs, watching the water beneath the ice move, slow, silent. The fish swam deep, invisible, but he could feel them. The mountain had taught him to sense life without sight, to trust the quiet pulse that connected everything. He knew when to fish, when to hunt, when to rest, not because of schedules or tools, but because the silence told him. The world below called it instinct. He called it harmony. Visitors came rarely, but they came. A lost hiker once stumbled upon his cabin, nearly frozen, eyes wide with fear and disbelief. The man took him in, fed him, warmed him, said little. The hiker spoke endlessly that night, desperate to fill the quiet with noise. The next morning, when the storm cleared, he looked around and said, "How can you live like this? No voices, no music, no one." The old man smiled faintly. "You hear nothing because you never stop talking," he replied. "The mountain sings all the time." The hiker didn't understand, not then. But years later, another traveler told the hermit that the same man had returned to the mountain, searching for that silence again. Some things stay with you, even if you don't yet know why. Over time, the man stopped seeing the world as something separate. The snow that fell on his cabin roof, the wolves howling in the distance, the flicker of the aurora above were all. The silence wasn't outside, it was inside. The mountain had carved away everything false until only truth remained, and that truth was simple. Life doesn't need to be filled to be full. He no longer chased purpose. He lived it, moment by moment, breath by breath. Each act, no matter how small, carried meaning. Tending the fire was a ritual. Cutting wood was meditation. Fishing through ice, prayer. Sometimes, when dawn came soft and pale, he would walk to a high ridge where he could see the valley below, a sea of cloud and forest stretching endlessly. He'd stand there, unmoving, for what felt like hours. In that vast stillness, he often thought of the people down there living in their endless hurry, measuring life in numbers and noise. He didn't judge them. He understood them too well. He had been one of them. But he also knew that the peace they sought could never be found in movement. Peace lives in stillness, and stillness requires courage. It means facing everything you've been running from, the noise in your head, the ache in your heart, the silence you fear most. He had faced it, and it had set him free. There were nights when the stars seemed close enough to touch. He would step outside, let the cold bite his skin, and look up until his eyes blurred. The silence in those moments was infinite, vast enough to swallow thought itself. He didn't feel small beneath the stars. He felt complete. Everything he had lost, everything he had once mourned, seemed to glow above him, eternal and unbroken. In that endless quiet, he finally understood what it meant to belong, not to a place, not to a person. Existence itself. The man who had once fled from pain had become the keeper of peace. The world below had mocked his solitude, called it madness, but they didn't know that silence is the loudest truth there is. It tells you who you are when nothing else remains, and in that knowing, you become Every scar, every memory, every breath of cold was part of the same great lesson, that the world doesn't need conquered, only understood. Sometimes, when he stood by the lake, he barely recognized the face. The man he had been was gone, replaced by someone simpler, quieter, wiser. His hands were rough, his hair gray, but his eyes carried a light that no storm could dim. He had built nothing that would last in the world's eye. No wealth, no name, no legacy in stone. Yet he had built something greater, a life unbroken by loss, unshaken by solitude, untouched by time. He thought the only kind of success. If you've ever wished for quiet, if you've ever longed to step away from the world's noise, remember this: the silence you seek is already within you. It's not a place you travel to. It's a truth you uncover. The mountain only reminds you of what's always been there. The winter that changed everything began without warning. It came early that year, colder than he had ever known, heavier in snow, sharper in wind. Even the birds seemed to vanish before it arrived, leaving behind only the whisper of empty branches. The man had lived through countless winters before, each one its own kind of teacher. But this one was different. The air itself felt strange, thick with something on. The lake froze faster than usual. The wood cracked louder in the fire. Silent. His oldest companion felt less like comfort and more like warning. He didn't fear it, but he respected. In the mountains, respect is survival. He began his usual preparations weeks in advance. He stocked firewood, dried meat, gathered herbs, reinforced the cabin walls. He moved through his tasks with calm precision. But even so, something out of rhythm. The animals had gone deeper into the forest. Even the wolves were quiet. One morning, as he stepped out to check the traps, he noticed the snow carried no track. It was as if life itself had taken shelter from what was coming. He stood for a long moment, eyes scanning the ridges. The air was still, too still, and in that stillness he felt the mountain watching him. Days later, the storm came. It started as a whisper, then grew into a roar that swallowed everything. The wind screamed through the valley, tearing branches from trees, burying paths he had walked for years. Snow fell without pause for 3 days and nights, thick and blinding, until the world outside disappeared entirely. Inside the cabin, the fire was his only companion, its glow flickering like a fragile heartbeat against the storm's rage. He sat close to it, listening to the wind batter the walls, feeling the cold creep through the smallest cracks. He had survived many storms, but this one was alive, as if the mountain itself had chosen to test again. By the 4th day, his food was low, the woodpile near the cabin buried under nearly 2 meters snow. He waited, patient but alert, until the wind softened. When it finally did, he stepped outside into a world transformed. The landscape he knew was gone, buried beneath endless white. Trees were bent and broken, paths erased, the lake invisible beneath a thick crust of ice. For a moment, even he felt small, not afraid, but humbled. The mountain had spoken in its oldest language, power, and now it was his turn to. He spent the next hours digging, uncovering the woodpile, clearing a narrow the door to the lake. The work was slow, the cold merciless. His breath froze on his beard, his fingers burned despite the gloves. He worked until his muscles trembled, then stopped, standing in the middle. That he heard it, a sound faint, far, but unmistakable, a cry, not the call of an animal, something human. He turned toward the ridge, heart. The sound came again, weaker this time. Someone was out there. Without hesitation, he grabbed his rope, his fur cloak, and began climbing. The snow was deep, the wind biting, but he moved with the confidence of one who knew every contour of the mountain. Halfway up, he saw movement, a dark shape against the snow. When he reached it, he found a young hunter, barely more than a boy, half buried and shaking cold. His face pale, his lips blue, his eye unfocused. The man knelt beside him, brushing snow from his face. "Easy now," he said quietly, though the boy likely couldn't hear. He wrapped him in his cloak, lifted him onto his shoulders, and began the slow descent back to the cabin. It took hours. The snow made every step heavy, every breath sharp. The boy drifted in and out of consciousness, whispering incoherent words about losing his way, about chasing a stag into the storm. By the time they reached the cabin, the man's body ached with exhaustion, but he didn't stop. He laid the boy near the fire, stripped off his frozen clothes, and wrapped him in blanket. For hours he tended to him, melted snow for water, watched the faint pulse. The mountain tested him, but this time it tested him through compassion. The boy lived. By morning, his breathing steadied, color returned to his cheeks. When he finally opened his eyes, confusion filled them. "Where am I?" he whispered. The man smiled faintly. "Home," he said simply. The boy looked around, dazed. "You saved me." The man shrugged. The mountain allowed it. He gave him water, broth, and silence. The boy spoke little that day, too weak to say much. But when night came, he asked the question most travelers eventually asked, "Why do you live here alone?" The man didn't answer right away. He stirred the fire, watching the sparks rise like stars. "Because the mountain is honest," he said finally. "It gives what you earn and nothing more." The boy stayed for several days, regaining strength. In that time, he watched how the man lived, the quiet precision of every task, the patience in every movement. He saw how the man spoke to the mountain without words, how he seemed to know what the weather would do before it happened. On the 5th day, when the storm had fully cleared, the boy insisted on helping with the fishing. The man agreed. Together, they walked to the lake, now buried under layers of ice thicker than ever. The boy watched curiously as the man prepared the hole, slow and deliberate as always. When he took out the pouch of herbs and sprinkled them into the water, the boy frowned. "You really believe that works?" he asked. The man smiled. "Belief is for those who don't understand." I listened. Minutes, then hours, and nothing happened. The boy grew restless, shifting his feet, rubbing his hands for warmth. "There's nothing down there," he muttered. "The water's frozen solid." But the man didn't move. He just kept watching the hole, still as the mountain. And then, just when the boy turned to leave, the surface rippled. A shadow rose beneath the ice, slow and deliberate. The man lifted his spear and struck, swift and sure. When he pulled it back, another fish, larger than the boy had ever seen, thrashed in the air. His eyes widened. "How?" he began, but the man only looked at him with a calm smile. "The mountain provides for those who listen," he said, "and it always will." That night, they shared the fish, the fire. The boy said little, but his gaze was different now, quieter, more thoughtful. He no longer looked at the old man with disbelief, but with respect. Before dawn, he packed his things to leave. As he stood at the door, he hesitated. "Will I ever learn to hear it the way you do?" he asked. The man looked at him for a long moment, then nodded toward the window, where the first light touched the frozen lake. "You will," he said, "when you stop trying to talk louder than the wind." The boy left, walking down the mountain with slow, careful steps. The man watched him disappear into the mist, smiled faintly. For the first time in years, he felt something stir inside. Not loneliness, not longing, a quiet joy of sharing what the silence had given him. The mountain had tested him, yes, but not through cold or hunger. It had tested whether he could still care, whether the solitude that had healed him could also open again to others. And the days that followed were brighter, the air clearer. It was as if the mountain itself softened. The man returned to his rhythm, cutting wood, fishing, tending the fire. But something had changed. When he stood by the lake now, he thought of the boy, of the world beyond these peaks, and of how every person must someday face their own. His solitude had once been a refuge, pain, but now it would place strength, a home he could share. Even weeks later, climbed to the ridge one evening, he saw a small figure far below, near the tree line. The boy had returned, not alone this time, but with 2 others. They were building a small camp, careful, deliberate, quiet. He smiled. The mountain was teaching again. That night, as he sat by the fire, he realized the discovery wasn't the fishing trick, nor even survival. It was something deeper. That wisdom only matters when it's shared. The mountain had given him silence, but now it asked him to give it back, not in word, but in example. That was the true cycle. The student becomes the teacher. The echo becomes the voice. He leaned back, listening to the wind outside, the faint hum of life returning after the storm. Everything was as it should be. The challenge had passed, the lesson was learned, and the discovery was simple yet eternal. Peace is not found in avoiding the world, but in understanding your place within it. And if you've walked this far beside him, remember, every storm ends, every silence speaks, and every lesson waits for the one patient enough to listen. Stay with him. There's more to come, and the mountain still has secret to share. Subscribe so you won't miss what happens when silence gives way to reflection. He often thought about the world below, not with judgment, but with a kind of quiet sorrow. From the high ridges, where clouds brushed the rocks like restless travelers, he could almost see it. The cities glowing faintly at night, the endless hum of people moving, chasing, reaching. He remembered that rhythm too well. It was the rhythm of hunger, not the hunger that comes from an empty stomach, but the one that grows in the soul when you've forgotten how to be still. Down there, they called it ambition, progress, success. Up here, it looked like noise. The man no longer blamed the world for its chaos. He simply understood it differently now. He knew that people weren't born lost. They just stopped listening to the silence that once lived inside. Sometimes, when the wind carried just right, he thought he could hear faint echoes, the far-off hum of machines, maybe a distant plane slicing through the sky. They didn't disturb him. If anything, they reminded him how far he had come from that life. He'd been part of it once, waking up to alarms, measuring worth in hours, drowning in the clamor of voices that said more and meant less. Back then, he had thought silence empty. Now, he knew it was the opposite, space where truth breathed. The mountain had taught him that when you strip away the noise, what remained is not but everything that mattered. He often wondered how many people could live there without ever hearing the sound of real, not the absence of noise, but the presence of peace, the kind that hums beneath the heartbeat, that sits in the air between breaths. Down there, people filled their lives with words and screens, chasing connection but fearing quiet. Here, he had learned that silence is not the enemy connection. It is the root of everything in nature. Spoke through silence, the trees through stillness, the snow through patience, the river through rhythm, even the stars. And yet looked long people had forgotten how to hear. He thought about this often when he watched the lake. Its surface reflected the sky perfectly, a mirror too honest for most to face. When he looked into it, he didn't see an old man or a hermit. He saw time itself, not as an enemy, but as a teacher. He had aged, yes, but the mountain had aged with him. Every wrinkle on his face matched a crack in the stone, every scar on his hands a mark of understanding. He didn't measure his life in years anymore, but in winters survived, lessons learned. The world below feared age. It called it decline. But here, age was a crown. It meant you had listened long enough to learn. Sometimes when travelers found their way up the valley, they would ask him what he had gained by living here so long. He always gave the same and nothing that can be owned. At first they looked disappointed, as if expecting secrets of treasure or wisdom wrapped in words. But then, if they stayed long enough, they began to understand. What he had gained was presence, the ability to be fully without wanting to be elsewhere. It was the simplest and hardest thing a person could learn. Down below, people were everywhere, but never truly present. They spoke while thinking of other things, worked while dreaming of rest, rested while fearing the work ahead. They were never where they were, and because of that, they missed everything that he had stopped thinking of his solitude as separation long ago. To him, the mountain was not isolation. It was unity. Every sound, every shadow, every breath of wind was connected. When he walked through the forest, he didn't see trees and animals as separate things. He saw them as movements of one living body, the same body that beat inside his chest. That was his greatest discovery, that the world was not made of parts, but of patterns, and he was one of them. The more he listened, the more he realized that nothing ever truly disappears. The snow melts and becomes river. The tree falls and becomes soil. The breath leaves the body and becomes wind. Death itself was not an ending here, a transformation. The world below feared ending. Up here, he had learned to welcome. He often thought of his younger self, the man who had once worked too much, loved too briefly, and lost too suddenly. He didn't pity him, and he understood him. That man had been doing what everyone else did, trying to find meaning outside himself. It wasn't his fault that the world taught him to run faster instead of to stop, but if he could speak to that version of himself now, he would tell him something simple. Slow down. You already have everything you're looking for. The tragedy of modern life, he realized, was not that people lacked what they needed, but that they no longer knew how to see it. In the evenings, he would sometimes sit by the fire and watch the flame shift from gold to blue. Fire, he thought, was the perfect teacher. It consumed everything but left behind light and warmth. It destroyed, yet it gave. He saw himself in that. The pain he had carried for so long had burned away everything unnecessary, leaving behind something purer, not emptiness, but clarity. The world called such things loss. The mountain called it becoming. He wondered how many people would understand that if they stopped running from their own storm. Every so often, letters would arrive, small notes left by the travelers who had heard of the hermit of the mountain. Some thanked him for shelter, others for silence. One letter came from the boy he had saved, now grown. It said simply, "I hear it now, the silent. Thank you." The man smiled when he read it. It was proof that what the mountain teaches never dies. It moves from one soul to another as naturally as wind across the snow. He placed the letter in a wooden box near the fire, where it joined others, small, fragile reminders that even a quiet life can echo far beyond it. He no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. The mountain stripped him of pride long ago. He didn't think of himself as wise, only as someone who had listened longer than most. Wisdom, he realized, isn't knowing more. It's needing less. The world below mistook simplicity for poverty, silence for emptiness, slowness for weakness. But he knew better. He knew that peace isn't found in abundance, but in balance. The lake never overflowed. It took only what it needed. The trees grew only as far as the light. The wolf never hunted more than hunger demanded. Nature didn't hoard, didn't boast, didn't rush, and yet it thrived. Humanity could learn much from that. Sometimes, in the stillest hours of night, when the moonlight turned the snow to silver, he wondered what people would remember of him. Probably nothing, he thought. His name would fade, his cabin would one day crumble, his tools would rust, but that didn't trouble him. Legacy, as the world understood it, was just another kind of noise. What mattered wasn't what was remembered, but what was lived. He had lived fully, honestly, quietly. That was enough. He thought often of time, not as a straight line, but as a circle. Every season mirrored another. Every lesson returned in new form. The mountain never grew tired of teaching, and he never grew tired of learning. In that cycle, he found peace. He realized that even the smallest lived with awareness, holds the entire universe. Every spark of the fire, every melted snow, every wind was a reminder of that truth. The world below searched for meaning in grand ideas, power and invention, but meaning was already here in the simple act of breathing. He sometimes wondered what would happen when he was gone. Would someone else find the cabin, the fishing hole, trails, carves, boots? Would they feel what he felt? They only see wood, stone. He hoped quiet that whoever found this sense it presence, spirit of the mountain. Because silence, once discovered, never really leaves you. It follows you into every noise, whispering beneath the surface, reminding you of what's real. He looked out one evening as the sun set behind the peaks, turning the world gold and crimson. It struck him then that the mountain was his home, but his reflection, vast, quiet, enduring. He had come here broken and left whole. He had arrived seeking escape and found belonging. The mountain hadn't healed him by erasing his pain. It had taught him to live with it, to shape it into something beautiful. And that, he thought, was the greatest wisdom of all. Not to erase the storms within us, but to learn how to dance. He closed. The wind was gentle. The fires. Somewhere in the distance a wolf called out, not in loneliness song. The sound echoed through the rye, falling, fading into silence. He smiled. Everything was exactly as it should be. The final winters of his life came quietly, as if the mountain itself wished not to disturb him. He was older now, though he hardly. Time had stopped being a number long ago. The body grew slower, the hair turned white, but his eyes remained clear, still reflecting the calm blue of the frozen lake. Every movement he made was deliberate, not out of frailty, but out of reverence. When you live long enough in silence, even the smallest act feels sacred. Lighting the fire, mending a tool, stepping into the snow, each a prayer of gratitude. The mountain had given him everything, and now the circle closed. He could feel it calling him gently back. The winters no longer felt, they felt like home. He had learned to read the cold as one reads an old friend, understanding every mood, every whisper of wind. When storms came, he didn't see danger. He saw snow fell for days without pause. He saw renewal. And when the first thaw began, he felt the same joy he had felt every spring. Though his hands trembled a little more each year, the mountain and the man had aged together, and in their shared stillness they had become inseparable. He often thought that if he ever left, his heart would keep beating in the rhythm of these peaks. In his final years, travelers still found their way to him. Some came seeking shelter, others seeking wisdom they couldn't name. He gave both freely, though he never thought of himself as a teacher. He simply shared what silence had given him. When they asked for advice, he always said the same thing: stop running from quiet. Most nodded politely, not understanding, but a few did. You could see it in their eyes. Small, sudden recognition that silence isn't emptiness, but truth. Those were the ones who left differently, walking down the trail slower. Looking back one last time, the mountain itself had spoken. One spring, the boy he had saved years ago returned, grown man, strong, steady, with the same calm light in his gaze. He carried food, tools, and a notebook filled with sketches of the mountain. "I've built my home down there," he said, pointing toward the valley, "close enough to hear the wind from your ridge." The old man smiled, the kind of smile that carries no surprise, only quiet pride. "Good," he said. "Then you've learned to listen." They shared a meal by the fire that night, the same way they had on that long-ago winter when the boy's life had hung by a thread. The young man spoke of his own of how he taught others to fish as the hermit had taught, of how he told stories about the man who pulled dinner from frozen water. The old man laughed gently. Stories change, but truth stays the same. The mountain will teach you more than I ever could. When the young man left the next morning, he didn't say goodbye. He knew he didn't need to. Between them, there was no farewell, only silence. And in that silence, everything that words could never. The old man watched him vanish into the trees, and for the first time, he felt no trace of loneliness. He realized then that his life had never been about isolation. It had been about connection, deep, quiet, invisible connection that stretched beyond sight or time. The silence had not taken him away from the world. It had brought him closer to it. As the seasons turned once more, the man's strength began to fade. He didn't fight it. The mountain teaches acceptance, not resist. He still rose each morning, still walked to the lake, still listened, but his steps were slower, and the air felt heavier in his lungs. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the peaks, he sat by the water and watched the ice glow in shades of gold and blue. The lake was perfectly still, a mirror of the sky. He thought of his wife and son, of the laughter that had once filled his life, and for the first time in many years, he He whispered their names aloud. The sound was soft, carried gently by the wind, and it felt right. He smiled because, hey, he understood that love doesn't disappear. It changes form like water, like light, like him. That night, he built a fire outside instead of in the cabin. The flames rose bright against the dark, flickering reflections dancing across the snow. He sat beside it, wrapped in furs, and let his eyes wander over the horizon. The stars had come out one by one, patient and eternal. Somewhere deep in the valley, wolves called to one another, their voices echoing across the peaks. It was the same song he had heard 1,000 times before, but this time it sounded different. It sounded complete. The mountain was alive, the silence breathing all around him, and he felt himself a part of it, not as a man against nature, but as a note within its endless song. When the fire finally burned low, he closed his eyes, his breath slowing to the rhythm of the wind. He wasn't a death, he knew, wasn't an ending here. It was a returning, a merging with the silence that had always been his truest companion. He felt the cold on his skin, the heartbeat of the earth beneath him, and in that final moment he smiled. The mountain had given him life, and now it would keep him. When morning came, the fire was out, the snow untouched, and the cabin door stood open to the dawn. Days later, the young man returned. He found the cabin, the bed empty, the air still warm with the scent of smoke and pine. On the table lay the old photograph, the woman, the man. Beside it was the wooden box of letters, a single line carved of bark. Listen, the young man stood for a long time, reading that single word over and over, feeling its weight. He stepped out, looked toward the lake, and understood. The old man was gone, but not gone. The mountain had taken him home. In the years that the cabin remained standing, travelers still passed through, still spoke of the man who had fished through frozen waters and found peace in solitude. Some said his spirit watched over the ridge, guiding those who came lost or broken. Others said that on certain mornings, when the light hits the lake just right, you can see his reflection kneeling by the eye, listening. Whether true or not, the silence of the place felt alive, full of presence, full of meaning. The mountain had absorbed him completely, and in doing so, it had shared him with everyone who came after. The young man who had once been saved became the mountain's new voice. He lived in the valley, teaching others the lessons he had learned, not through speeches or books, but through patience. He showed them how to fish through ice, how to read the wind, how to hear the quiet pulse beneath the noise. He never claimed to be a teacher. He said only, I learned from a man who listened. And so the legacy continued, not through fame or name, but through action, through the stillness passed from one heart to another. The mountain, timeless and unchanging, remained as it always had, vast, silent, patient. The lake froze and thawed, the storms came and went, the seasons turned in their endless dance. But those who came here felt something unexplainable, a calm that settled deep within. They didn't need to be told the story, because the mountain still whispered his truth to those willing to hear, that peace is not found in running from the world, but in understanding it. That silence is not the absence of life, but the language of it, and that even one quiet man alone in the snow can leave behind an echo that never fades. In the end, his legacy was not written in stone or paper, but in the air, the trees, the still water of the lake. It lived in the moments of quiet that people carried back to their own noisy lives, moments when they remembered to pause, to breathe, to listen. That was his gift to the world he had once left behind. Not advice, not doctrine, not greatness, only silence. And in that silence, everything. So now, if you've reached the end of his story, take a moment, stop, breathe, listen. Maybe you'll hear it too. The whisper of the mountain, the heartbeat of the earth, the echo of a man who once found peace in frozen water. And if you did, then carry it with you. Comment below where you're watching this from. Share this story if it touched, and subscribe for more tales like this one, because silence, my friend, is not the end. It's where everything begins.